Chapter 8. Buteyko searches for Parin. The lead-up to his discovery. After visiting the Scientific Council's secretary, Buteyko went straight to the rector of the Novosibirsk Medical Institute. The rector was perhaps the only person who could help him. He had the power to replace a referee a few days before the defense. The rector readily understood the opposition Buteyko faced for his advocacy of carbon dioxide, as he himself had provoked massive opposition in the Ministry of Health for daring to propound the theory that rheumatism was caused by a virus. You say that Sharadov refused to support you," said the rector, leafing through Buteyko's dissertation. "How very odd." The rector's bowed shoulders looked as if they were slumping under a heavy burden. "How long is it until your defence?" 9 days, not counting today," sighed Buteyko. "We know that you're an outstanding diagnostician." The rector laid the manuscript aside. "You have the patent for the calibrated ballistocardiograph?" He didn't speak for a moment. "Of course, I would be glad to be your referee." It was as if a weight had been lifted from Buteyko's mind. "I'll ring academician Parin in Moscow," he thought, "and find out why he hasn't submitted a review. It would mean disturbing him, of course. I'll fly to the capital to bring back the review myself. It'll be difficult, but I should make it in time." So Buteyko imagined. But subsequent events were to complicate his task still further, so much so that success would have been beyond the capability of any other person. Buteyko, however, was helped by his gifts of foresight and telepathy, in which few people believed at that time. Academician Parin had publicly denied the existence of telepathy on many occasions, but these events would make him change his mind. For years afterwards, he would continue to ask Buteyko's acquaintances how on earth the doctor had managed to do what he had done. Buteyko rang Parin at 10 p.m. from his office. It was Parin's daughter who answered. "Dad flew to Armenia a few days ago with Mum. They're planning to travel around the Caucasus by car." Buteyko nearly dropped the receiver. "Haven't they at least left an itinerary? Please understand, my PhD is at stake." For a few seconds the only sound was crackling on the line. I've said more than I should," the girl said, her voice trembling. "Mum wanted to take Dad away somewhere where no one could bother him about work. He's so tired. That's why they've gone on a road trip instead of staying at a hotel. I only know they've gone to the Caucasus, and they probably don't know their itinerary themselves." It was at this moment that Buteyko understood that Professor Pomykin had set him up. For a start, it was summer, and it would be difficult to get a ticket south, and that was assuming he knew where to go. Perhaps it would be better to postpone his defence. But, on the other hand, it was difficult for the Scientific Council to assemble, and this would probably be the first and last time they met at the Institute. If he didn't manage to defend his dissertation now, he might not get another chance. Pomykin, for one, would make sure of that. He and Marina spent a restless night. She shared his feeling of foreboding. Buteyko had told her the bare facts without getting into details. It wasn't that he didn't trust his wife, but given that she might talk to Pomykin behind his back, he decided to play safe. "Professor Pomykin's up to something with my dissertation defence," he muttered vaguely to his wife when they were in bed. "There was some kind of cross next to my name." Early next morning he took almost all their savings and set off to the airport. He left a note for his wife on the kitchen table. "I need to fly to Moscow urgently to talk to someone about my dissertation. If anyone asks, you don't know where I am. I'm away on business." He wasn't actually going to Moscow, but God helps those who help themselves. At the airport there was such a long queue to buy tickets that Buteyko realized just how right Pomykin had been to count on the summer rush. "Apparently all the tickets up until 28th of August have been sold," said a woman in a red headscarf who was standing in front of Buteyko. "So, why is everyone queuing?" asked the doctor with a grim smile. "They're waiting, just in case. Maybe someone won't show up, or maybe they'll find some extra seats." The woman took off her headscarf and dabbed her hot red face with it. In the end, the airport doctor, an acquaintance of Buteyko's, managed to get him a ticket to Adler, a resort on the Black Sea. Buteyko knew exactly when and with whom to make friends. 2 hours later he was sitting comfortably in the plane, his head pleasantly cooled by the current of air from the vent above. He could see the plane's right wing and its rows of grey rivets. Why was he flying to Adler? Buteyko himself would have been hard-pressed to give an answer. Academician Parin and his wife could be in Tbilisi, Sukhumi, or anywhere. But as he'd gazed at the map of the Caucasus, the doctor's inner voice had told him to go to Adler. The sight of the pretty white clouds floating above the wing lulled Buteyko into a doze, but he didn't manage to sleep. Why had his discovery caused him so many problems? For the umpteenth time he remembered that cold October night in 1952, when he'd mistaken the hypertensive patient gasping for breath for an asthmatic. The patient had been the last link in a chain of logic that he'd been constructing for years. The first link in this chain had been an unusual incident in the winter of 1949, when he was in his 3rd year at medical school. One evening, while on duty at the hospital, he had listened to the chest of a ruddy, muscular 21-year-old patient who appeared the picture of health. "Breathe deeply," Buteyko directed the patient, pressing the stethoscope to his broad, hairy chest. "And even deeper." Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The seemingly healthy patient collapsed onto the floor. Buteyko tried his best to bring him round, then rushed into the corridor to look for the assistant duty doctor. An elderly nurse was sweeping the floor. "What's the matter?" she asked, straightening up and rubbing her side. "I've just been listening to a patient's chest, and he fainted." "Don't worry," said the nurse, instantly understanding the situation. "You've just made him over-breathe." She calmly soaked some cotton wool in ammonia and held it under the patient's nose. "He'll be better in a moment. It happens all the time." The patient was indeed back on his feet in just a few moments. "He collapsed from over-breathing," Buteyko told the assistant duty doctor. "What's so unusual about that?" asked the doctor, shrugging his thin shoulders. "He probably fainted because too much oxygen went to his brain. It sometimes happens when students listen to patients' chests, especially heart and asthma patients." Buteyko was perplexed by this explanation. It just didn't seem right. The students were constantly lectured about the benefits of oxygen and told to use an oxygen mask to treat heart attacks, yet this young heart patient had fainted when he wasn't having an attack or breathing pure oxygen, just breathing deeply. And the doctor had told him that this was a common phenomenon. Something just wasn't right. Buteyko's high grades and status as top student entitled him to use the Central Medical Library, to which students weren't normally allowed access. He went straight to the library after he had finished his shift and consulted a pile of books. He became convinced that his doubts were well-founded. In 1949, there were already a number of publications that pointed to the dangers of deep breathing. Various researchers had noticed that deep breathing removes excessive amounts of carbon dioxide from the body, leading to a fall in blood carbon dioxide. This increases the affinity between oxygen and hemoglobin, known as the Bohr effect. As hemoglobin then releases less oxygen into the tissues become starved of oxygen. Although it seems paradoxical, the deeper you breathe, the less oxygen your tissues receive. Buteyko was still confused. What had the assistant duty doctor meant when he said that the patient had fainted from too much oxygen going to his brain? He raised this question a few days later. "The last time we spoke, You said the patient fainted from an oversupply of oxygen to the brain, but world-famous scientists say the opposite," said an embarrassed Buteyko, listing the names of articles and summarizing their content. "Stop talking drivel," snapped the young doctor, normally so calm and friendly. Buteyko was stunned into silence by this turn in the conversation. "It's winter. Your brains shouldn't be addled from heat-stroke," he added, softening as he saw Buteyko's confusion. "But don't go spouting this rubbish to Academician Daryev. Great scientists have confirmed that oxygen regulates breathing. He has himself, you know." The assistant doctor raised his eyes to the ceiling in veneration. "The Academician thinks well of you. Don't spoil it. And as for that incident where your patient collapsed, he didn't faint from a lack of oxygen, but from an oversupply." He noticed disbelief in Buteyko's eyes and added, "Countless processes take place in the body, thousands of chemical reactions. Do you really think we understand everything? Not at all. Far from it. But the general direction is clear, and you shouldn't try to depart from it." The young doctor patted him on the back. "You'd better get back to the institute, or heaven forbid you be late for lectures. Learn the basics first, master the lower slopes, and worry about the peaks later." The sun shone through the aeroplane window, and Buteyko could feel that he was flying south. The stewardess served lemonade in plastic cups, and Buteyko sipped his with enjoyment. The young doctor's explanation that the patient had fainted from excess oxygen hadn't convinced Buteyko. He held his tongue, but the seeds of doubt had been sown. Buteyko made the second link in the chain of logic as he watched seriously ill patients dying. Again, while in his third year of medical school, he realized that becoming a doctor would mean waging a lifelong battle against death. He decided to visit the terminal ward more frequently at night so that he could observe hundreds of deaths. This was an arduous task for such a young man, but Buteyko put the interests of science above all else. He would remember those terrible night vigils in the terminal ward for the rest of his life. Hardly any patients left the ward alive. Sooner or later they were covered with a white sheet and carried out feet first. It's hard to stay beside a dying person's bedside in their final moments, but Buteyko sat there for hours from choice rather than duty. He put this experience to good use. He became able to predict the death of patients with such accuracy that the nurses on the ward started to whisper behind his back that he was a sorcerer. At first they didn't trust his judgment and shook their heads sceptically, but all doubts were banished when Buteyko correctly predicted the death of a major factory boss almost to the minute. The duty doctor quietly warned him not to parade his abilities too much. "I understand," the old doctor said, shutting the door of the duty room behind them, "that you want to cut a bit of a dash." He glanced almost fearfully around the shadowy and empty room. "But people might get the wrong idea. You've only got 2 months until you finish medical school. Do you think no one noticed that you predicted the factory boss's death with such accuracy? He wasn't a government minister, but these days you can lose everything if a foreman dies on your hands. You're just lucky that you've got Academician Daryev to protect you." The doctor looked straight at Buteyko. "You're playing a dangerous game with your quackery and hunches." Buteyko finished his lemonade. His night vigils in the terminal ward were the second step towards his discovery. His senior colleague had feared for him, and rightly so. Stalin's suspicion of doctors, culminating in the alleged doctor's plot to kill the Soviet leadership, confirmed this. Most importantly, the old doctor hadn't believed that it was possible to predict a patient's exact time of death. The incident with the factory boss had been blown out of proportion, of course. Buteyko had said only that the patient just had 4 or 5 hours left to live, but according to the subsequent rumours, Buteyko, the sorcerer, had predicted his death to the minute. Buteyko alone knew the secret of this sorcery. As he'd sat beside the dying, he had noticed that the onset of death directly correlated to an increase in the patient's depth of breath. The more deeply a patient breathed, the sooner he would die. The moment of death was, as a rule, characterized by a final deep breath, followed by an exhalation, and then the patient died. After watching dozens of deaths, Buteyko had learnt to use the depth of breath as a way of predicting with reasonable accuracy how long a patient had left. This connection between the depth of a dying patient's breathing and onset of death was the second step towards his discovery. At first he thought, like others before him, that patients' bodies were trying to combat death by breathing deeply. Only after his discovery did he understand the true role of deep breathing in dying. It was Mother Nature's way of cutting short the patient's torment, and the last gasp was like a knife in the heart to end their suffering completely. After Buteyko discovered the diseases of deep breathing in October 1952, he spent a month poring over books in the Central Medical Library before sharing his discovery with anyone in his department. As before, when he had studied the topic, after he had made the patient overbreathe and faint in 1949, he became convinced that a number of established medical facts could have made this discovery possible considerably earlier. He reread articles that said that during deep breathing the body loses excessive amounts of carbon dioxide. He even found an article that said that unusually low levels of CO2 had been observed in the cells of cancer patients. In all, there was every reason to believe that deep breathing was the cause of many widespread diseases. It would have taken years to compile a list of all of them, but Buteyko already knew for sure that it included asthma and hypertension, and he could add renal colic to the list. So why had no researcher thought to connect the dangers of deep breathing with diseases that were so obviously caused by its effects? After all, scientists had objectively proven that the Bohr effect resulted in oxygen deprivation and that CO2 deficiency caused vascular spasms. For example, what made an asthmatic gasp for air? Bronchial spasms. And what caused these spasms? The body's reaction to losing too much CO2 during deep breathing. It was so obvious, and yet the majority of doctors hadn't noticed. The plane was descending, and Buteyko felt the change of pressure in his ears. No, it wasn't that they hadn't noticed, but the prejudices of the establishment had proved too strong. The English professor Joseph Haldane had come very close to establishing that breathing was regulated by carbon dioxide, but then Heymans and Cordia discovered oxygen receptors and confirmed the oxygen theory of breathing. Haldane's research was buried, and as a result, millions of patients with asthma and hypertension were suffering, and it was beyond the power of oxygen-obsessed medicine to help them.